Thank you, Tracy, and thank you so much for inviting us to speak and for all of you for giving us time on your very action-packed agenda. We're really grateful to be here to hear your stories and to share a little update on Amylyx and the Helios Trial. My name is Jamie Timmons. I'm a medical doctor. You can call me Jamie. You don't have to call me Dr. Timmons. I work for Amylyx Pharmaceuticals on their medical affairs. And my colleague Irene is here too. She is our head of global patient and professional advocacy. So our lawyers make me say this. So just to note that we're going to be talking about Amylyx 35 today, which is currently not approved in any country in the world for Wolfram syndrome. But we'll talk about what we can do to hopefully change that. So our agenda, we're going to go through the development process for developing medicines and show you where we are right now at Amylyx and where we hope to be in the future. We'll go a little bit into background about Amylyx 35 and why we're studying Amylyx 35 in Wolfram syndrome. I'll walk you through the Helios Trial in terms of the study design, the endpoints that we're measuring, and why we're looking at what we're looking at. Give you some updates and share what's next. And then I do have a section where I'm going to answer some frequent questions that we get, and then we'll also have time for any additional questions that you have as well too. We will be here throughout the day. We'll be here for dinner tonight. Please don't be shy. Come up to us if you have questions or just want to say hi. So please feel free to do so. That's why we're here. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through the medicine development process. So the way this slide is going to work, it's going to build. There's going to be an arrow starting on the left side, and we're going to work through each point. So every time I click, we're going to go into a next stage of the process. So this is why the medicine development process takes some time. Generally, it can take about 10 to 15 years, sometimes a little bit shorter, unfortunately, sometimes even longer than that. And so why is that? Why does it take so long? Especially when people are living with diseases that have a huge impact on their life and there's no treatments for it. Why are we taking so long? So it really is a stepwise process, and each step can take quite some time. So the first step is really thinking of the idea. So doing the initial research, the initial development of a therapeutic, coming up with the idea for why a drug might work in a particular disease. The story for Amylyx and Wolfram syndrome is a really interesting one. Dr. Sarah Gladstone, who lives in the United States, actually reached out to our co-founders, and she has a child who has Wolfram syndrome. And she reached out and said, hey, you guys should study Amylyx 35 and Wolfram syndrome. I think it might work. And our co-founders were like, okay, sounds good. And so that's our story. Most stories aren't quite that simple, but it all starts with an idea and the initial research. So once you have that idea, then you need to get some initial proof that this drug might work. And so that's what we call preclinical studies. And by preclinical, we mean that we're looking not in humans. We're usually looking in cells in a petri dish. We're looking in mice, sometimes in cover the dog's ears, sometimes in dogs, and sometimes in monkeys or other primates. So these are early studies where we're trying to answer basic questions. Is a drug safe? Is it toxic, to the cells and to these animals before we're studying in humans? And so if the preclinical studies show, yes, this drug does appear to be safe, it's not super toxic, and we're seeing some signs that it might work, then we move into human studies. And human studies, you'll often hear us talk about phases of clinical trials. So phase 1 is early studies, where we're going to give the drug to very few people. First of all, to see, is it safe? Is it safe? Are they able to tolerate it? Is it causing any unwanted effects? Because we always, as an adage in medicine, first want to do no harm. So phase 1 studies are usually small studies. Sometimes they're in what the field calls healthy volunteers, so people who do not have the disease. But sometimes phase 1 studies are in people who have the disease and volunteer to get into the study. So if we get past the phase 1 study part, if everything looks good there, then we go into phase 2 studies. And so here, we're opening up the group of people. We're looking at this drug in additional folks. And phase 2 studies are almost always in people with the disease. So we're starting to look at how does this drug work in people with the condition that we're trying to treat. These are typically a little bit smaller than the next step, which is phase 3 studies. Phase 3 studies are usually large. They're sometimes longer studies. And again, they're in that same group of people that we're studying in the condition. And so the reason we're doing kind of all of this is, of course, we want to know if the drug works, right? But we also need to go to the health authority in each country and say, look at all this evidence we have, look at all these studies we've done. This drug works, please approve it for us so that we can then get this drug to people who need it. And so you need to have a lot of evidence to show both efficacy and safety in a drug before you can do what's called your marketing authorization application. They call it different in the US. Every place has a slightly different way for talking about it, but it's basically you're gathering all the evidence you have, giving it to the FDA, the EMA, et cetera, and asking them to review and approve. If the drug gets approved, we don't stop there. We will continue to study the drug, perhaps in additional folks who weren't in the clinical trial, who didn't qualify for the trial, continuing to gather more information for evidence. So the reason this can take a while, and especially in a rare disease, is that each step, especially with the clinical trials, can take years. It can take years to do a phase 2 trial, years to do a phase 3 trial. So as you see, this all starts to add up into why it can take some time. So where are we with the Helios trial? We are right now in phase 2. So we're in phase 2 and nearing the completion of the first part of the phase 2 aspect, which I'll go into later. And we will need to do a phase 3 study for Amylyx 35 in Wolfram syndrome. Okay, so why study Amylyx 35 in Wolfram syndrome? So very simplistic diagram, but Amylyx 35 is believed to impact really key pathways that we know are involved in Wolfram syndrome. And these came up earlier in some of our sessions, the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria. And so we know that in Wolfram syndrome, the genetic mutations, some may call variants or other language, but when there's a change in the gene, that is impacting the protein and the ability for the cell to function, which can lead to endoplasmic reticulum stress and impaired mitochondrial function. And this impact, this stress and dysfunction in the cell, is then what's leading to death and dysfunction of our neurons, of the pancreatic beta cells, which lead to some of the signs and symptoms that you see in Wolfram syndrome. And so Amylyx 35 is believed to act on both endoplasmic reticulum stress and mitochondrial dysfunction, so two of those pathways in the disease. And the hope being that we're able to improve that dysfunction, to lower it, get rid of it, that would then allow the pancreatic beta cells to live longer, the neurons to live longer, and perhaps for those symptoms to be delayed in their progression or to not be as severe. Another reason why we have moved into clinical studies of Amylyx 35 in Wolfram syndrome is the preclinical evidence. And if you remember earlier when we talked about the pathway to approval, preclinical evidence was kind of the second step. So that's when we're looking at cells, mice. We're seeing, does this drug impact the pathways that we think it should in Wolfram syndrome? And so Dr. Urano's name has been mentioned a few times today. As you likely know, he's a clinician and researcher in the United States at Washington, at WashU. And so he and his lab have done several experiments testing Amylyx 35 in preclinical models, including cell models of Wolfram syndrome, neuronal cell models, and pancreatic cell models, so looking at insulin secretion, et cetera. He's also studied it in Wolfram syndrome mice. So looking to see if you give Amylyx 35 to those mice, Do they have improved diabetic control? Do they live longer than mice that did not receive AMX35? And what we saw in those preclinical studies is that it does look like AMX35 is doing what we wanted to do. So in the cell models, we're improving insulin secretion. The cells are living longer, which is good. And in the Wolfram syndrome mice, their progression to diabetes was delayed. So these are all favorable signals that AMX35 is working on the disease pathways that we wanted to work on. So let's go into the clinical studies then. So about the Helios trial, which is the phase 2 trial. So I'm showing on this slide a simple schematic of the study design. And so the Helios study is overall a 96-week study. So it's a long trial. It's broken up into a few major parts. There's an initial screening period where, of course, we need to determine if people are eligible for the trial. Then they're in the first open label treatment period, which is 48 weeks. And then there's a treatment extension period after that for another 48 weeks where they have to come into the office a little bit less. It starts to become a little bit less arduous of an experience for participants. And then a follow-up period. This is what's called an open label trial. So that means everyone is receiving AMX35 in the Helios phase 2 trial. There is no placebo or dummy arm in the Helios trial. When we talk about the phase 3 trial in a bit, that will need a placebo arm. So that will be a little bit different of a trial setup. But for the Helios phase 2 trial, everyone is receiving the study drug, and there are 12 participants in the trial. So what we decided in terms of this trial that we were going to focus on was, of course, we always want to know safety. Always want to know, is the drug safe in this population of people with Wolfram syndrome in this specific trial? And then our key kind of primary objective was to see, does AMX35 improve pancreatic cell function? And so the way we're going to look at that is, how is diabetes controlled in participants in the trial? Are participants receiving AMX35, are they having better control of their diabetes? And we'll talk through how we're going to measure that when they're in the trial versus before they join the trial. And so what we're going to do, as I said, this is a long trial. We are going to take a look at the data at 6 months after everyone has been in the trial for 6 months, so at 24 weeks. And we are right at that point. So you may remember back in April, we shared what we call interim data, which is kind of a sneak peek data of the first 8 participants at week 24. And we did see some promising signals there. Now we're reaching to the point where all 12 participants have their week 24 data. Some have even more. Some have up to 48-week data. And as shared earlier, the database is locked, and the statisticians are locked away in a room crunching the numbers, and we actually plan to share that data in about 2 to 3 weeks in the middle of October at an upcoming conference. And we'll go through the plans to make sure that everyone has access to that data here as well, too. So who's in the Helios clinical trial? It's always important when you're evaluating any clinical trial to look at a few things. One is the entry criteria in terms of who is the drug being studied in. So a few key points. Participants in Helios are 17 or older. And you may ask, why that cutoff? Why can't you have younger participants in this study? It's because at the time we initiated this study, AMX35 hadn't previously, in those kind of preclinical phase 1 studies, hadn't been studied in early children yet. And so the FDA in this case said, you have data for adults to show that it's safe, but you don't have data for children to show that it's safe yet, so you can only do this trial in 17 and up. We certainly are working on getting that additional data in children to have subsequent studies be able to look at younger age groups. Of course, participants need to have a definite diagnosis of Wolfram syndrome, and this is 2 mutations on that WFS1 gene, so sometimes known as the classic form of Wolfram syndrome. Participants need to have some ability to produce their own insulin, and so that's what that stimulated C-peptide line is there. It's basically saying that their pancreas is still able to put out a bit of its own insulin. They're not completely reliant on external insulin. And they must be willing to wear a continuous glucose monitor, which I know we were speaking to earlier. It sounds like a lot of people really find quite useful anyway. And in the first part of the study, we did ask anyone that was on a GLP-1 agonist, so like Mounjaro, Ozempic, et cetera, to not take it. But in the second half of the study, we kind of released that restriction. And that was purely so that we could see what's Amylyx 35's effect on diabetes without having other medications potentially impacting the diabetes as well. So the endpoints that we'll be going through the study, and hopefully when we have the data in a few weeks, this will be a helpful background so that you have in your mind what to be looking for. So endpoints in the study are the Wolfram syndrome signs and symptoms that we're measuring. So there's a big long list on this slide, so we're going to go through them in detail. So many of the endpoints in Helios are measuring how well the pancreas is managing blood sugar levels. And we're looking at that in several different ways. So the main endpoint, the key endpoint, the primary endpoint of the study is the change from baseline in C-peptide. C-peptide levels measure the ability of the pancreas to produce insulin. So what we want to see is that if Amylyx 35 is working, the pancreas is able to produce more of its own insulin. If the pancreas is able to do that, then we would potentially see that people are needing to give themselves less of the what we call exogenous insulin, so needing to dose yourself less insulin because your body is producing more. We're also looking at the HbA1c, the hemoglobin A1c level, which is a measure telling us how well blood glucose is controlled over the previous 2 months. So key takeaway is we're looking at how diabetes is controlled in a variety of ways in Helios. Helios endpoints are also measuring vision. So just looking at visual acuity in terms of like the eye chart. And also using something called optical coherence tomography, which is an imaging technique that allows us to get a better look of what's going on in the eye and the optical. And finally, in Helios, we're also looking at more holistic overall measurements of health. So generally how people are feeling. So that's using the Wolfram United Rating Scale, the clinician and patient reported global impression change, and the most bothersome symptom. So takeaway here is Helios is looking at a variety of measures, diabetes, vision, overall health. There's other measures I didn't even put on here. We'll be looking at biomarkers. So we anticipate that we'll have a lot of data from this study that will help us to think about the design of the next study. So what is going on with the next study? And what's next? So as I shared earlier this year, we announced that initial data, that sneak peek data in 8 participants, and things did look good there. It's 8 participants, so we have to, kind of keep our excitement down. But from what we saw with the 8 participants, it gave us confidence, to continue on with the study and to be excited about the data we're going to get in a few weeks. Earlier this year, we also announced that we received orphan drug designation from the European Commission for Wolfram syndrome. I will go into what that means in a little bit, so we'll come back to that. We did also give FDA orphan drug designation a few years ago, too. So coming up, things to keep on your radar. This October, we will be presenting the data from all 12 participants at that 6-month mark of Helios at an upcoming conference. So this conference is the International Society for Pediatric and Adolescent Diabetes. That's October 16th through 19th. The conference itself, of course, will be pediatric endocrinologists, people who are diabetes specialists. But once we present it there, then it's considered what we call public. And so we can share more broadly. So we'll also look to have a webinar on our company website, and our team will also be attending the International Wolfram Syndrome Research Symposium later in October to share the data there as well too. So we'll make sure that those updates are provided to the scientific community and then also to the patient care community as well too. So really about a month for us to have that data. And then based off of that, what we call the interim data in April, which did look promising, we have had some initial discussions with the FDA and other experts, et cetera, to say, okay, this looks like it could be good. What should we think about for next steps? And so what the US FDA has told us is phase 3 trial, which we presumed we would have to do. So you need to do another trial. It needs to be placebo-controlled. And now what we're doing too is going to have those same conversations with Europe, with the UK, to understand, from the MHRA, from the EMA, what they would be looking for. Because sometimes they actually have slightly different endpoints or objectives, and so we need to kind of talk to each regulatory body about the trial to make sure that we can get as much consensus as possible. So that is what we are currently doing. The phase 3 trial is not designed yet. We do not know exactly where it will be, although Helios is only at one site in the United States, Dr. Urano. This phase 3 trial is larger. It will have more sites, and we anticipate that there will be sites outside of the United States, just given the trial and the size. Okay. We're always very careful not to say, yes, there's definitely going to be trial sites in X country until we know for sure. And so I know it may be frustrating if you come up and ask me, are there going to be sites in the UK? And I say, I don't know, we're still talking. That's the reason why, is we just don't want to promise anything until we have a definite answer for you. But as soon as we know the trial design, as soon as we have an answer, we're happy to share that and happy to provide more details in our answers. So frequently asked questions. So fairly easy one, can I or my loved one be enrolled in Helios? The answer is no, Helios is fully enrolled. So all 12 participants are in Helios. Enrollment has stopped in the Helios phase 2 trial. So that is not an option at the moment. What does orphan drug designation mean? I think it's helpful first to start with what orphan drug designation does not mean. So orphan drug designation does not have anything to do with the drug being approved or being able to have access to a drug. Orphan drug designation is something that the regulatory bodies have come up with to basically incentivize pharmaceutical companies to go in and investigate rare diseases. So they make the patents a little bit easier, they make it easier to speak with them, you could get advice on your study design easier, so it helps kind of accelerate the process, but it does not have anything to do with approval or access. Is it possible to get Amylyx certified? And every country has a different way they call this: compassionate use, expanded access, special access, etc. So the answer right now is no, and I'll go into more detail as to how Amylyx as a company thinks about access. Every company is going to have a slightly different approach to this, but I think you'll hear general themes when talking to pharmaceutical companies about access. So first and foremost, the most equitable and sustainable form of access is to get approval of the drugs in different countries. Because every country has a different access pathway. Some people may never be able to get like a special access program. But if we can get drugs approved, that opens up the ability for more people to access. So any kind of expanded compassionate access program that we have cannot impact the potential regulatory approval. And one thing that we always think about is we can't do any harm to people by providing them access to our drug. So our general policy is that we need to have safety and efficacy data from a phase 2 study before we will start thinking about these kinds of access programs. And as you just heard me say, we are getting close to that in Helios. And so as we're thinking about the phase 3 trial, we will also be thinking about access programs for people that are not eligible for the trial. But again, all of this is like a stepwise approach. It all sort of takes time. But I just want to share that if you reach out to us now with this question, our answer will be no. But in the future, we are working through the way to have the phase 3 trial and to also provide access outside of the trial as well too. Will the next trial have sites outside the US? So my answer there is it's highly likely. We don't know exactly which sites and we don't know exactly where. I mean, the UK has wonderful, as we've heard today, amazing capacity and ability. But right now we're in that early process of discussing with the different regulatory bodies to understand what the trial will look like. And once we understand that, then we'll know which sites and which countries to have the trial in. So basically stay tuned there. Can I or my loved one participate in the next trial? Sort of the easy answer to that is I don't know because we haven't designed the next trial yet. But the other thing I just want to share with you is that if you ask someone from a pharmaceutical company that question and the trial is designed, we still won't be able to answer that for you. We really have to be removed from the selection process for participants in a trial. That really needs to be the discussion between the clinician and the participant around if they're appropriate for the clinical trial. So if you ask me even after the trial design if you can be in it, I'll still have to say I'm sorry, I can't give you an answer there. You have to speak to your clinician about that. But the thing to take away is the trial's not designed yet. You're not missing out on being able to get in the trial yet. There's nothing to be enrolled in at the moment. Another one that comes up is, should I take the individual components of Amylyx 35, which are sodium phenylbutyrate and taurursodiol. Taurursodiol is also known as TUDCA. Again, pharmaceutical company answer, legal answer here is, I of course can't give you medical advice as to what you should or should not take. Any discussions around therapy and management should be with your care team and with your clinician. Things to consider with the individual components. Any clinical trial may have restrictions around taking investigational therapies, so that's an important consideration to have. And especially taurursodiol TUDCA, there are a variety of different forms of that out in the world, some that you can purchase on the internet, and I would just caution to ensure you're speaking to any clinician before you take something that you're not sure what is actually in it. We're not able to comment on kind of the safety and efficacy of those individual components. We can only comment on the safety and efficacy of our component because we control that tightly. And this one always makes me tear up. So many of you ask us what you can do to help us. And first and foremost, just please take care of yourself and take care of each other. But if you are looking for ways to get involved and to help the drug development process in general, I would say definitely consider clinical research. Clinical research does not necessarily mean being in a placebo-controlled trial. It may be providing samples. It may be being in observational studies, et cetera. So that's one area to consider. Of course, always speaking with your clinician and care team about what's best for you. We as a company are always looking for feedback and advice. And so when we design the next trial, we will pull together a group of people living with Wolfram syndrome, carers, other people who have been affected by the disease, to give us feedback on the study design, on the endpoints that we're measuring, and also to help us make sure that the way that we talk about the trial and provide informed consent about the trial makes sense. And so if that's something you would be interested in being a part of, please see me or Irene, or if it comes to you later, I'm sure Tracy can direct it to us. And the other thing I would say is just getting involved, getting involved with your Wolfram syndrome community, getting involved on the advocacy side, especially, hopefully we'll have 2 studies coming up with positive data, which would be amazing. And if that's the case, then the next step is speaking to the regulatory bodies to, have them approve these drugs. And they often need help in understanding the disease. They need help in understanding what's important for people who are living with the disease. So there's some education that can happen there as well too. And yeah, that's my last slide. So I'll open it up and see if anybody has any other questions. And also, as I said, please feel free to come up to us. Don't be shy. Or if anything hits you in a few weeks and you're like, oh, I wish I asked that, send one to Tracy and she'll send to us.
Lovely, thank you, Jamie. Are there any questions for Jamie?
What was the original condition that Amylyx was being looked at as a potential treatment for?
Yeah, so we've studied AMX35 in ALS, or motor neuron disease, in PSP, progressive supranuclear palsy, and Wolfram syndrome. So they're all neurodegenerative diseases, all have a component of endoplasmic reticulum stress and mitochondrial dysfunction as well too.
Thank you, really, really interesting, thank you.
Sure.
So my question is, when you expand to the phase 3 trial, and hopefully in Europe as well, as you know, a paediatric investigation plan ensures additional years of market exclusivity. Do you think you'll be able to include children in a future phase 3 study?
Yes, our regulatory team is already talking about the PIP. So that is of high interest to us. Dr. Barrett, we are working on the studies, especially the toxicology studies that are needed to support that package. What we may end up needing to do is moving into the phase 3 study, with a certain age range cutoff, and then opening up to younger children as time goes on, or having another study, with those who are perhaps less than 17 years old. That's all up for discussion at the moment, but I guess the main thing to get across is that we don't want to leave that younger population behind, especially if we see that this slows disease progression. It makes logical sense, right, that you would want to start taking the drug as soon as it was safe to do so.
Thank you. That was an excellent talk. Thank you so much. I noticed in your phase 2 study, you had to have a genetically confirmed diagnosis.
Correct.
But there are people with a clinical diagnosis of Wolfram syndrome who will not have both mutations. Will you be considering in the phase 3 study people who may have a clinical diagnosis but only one mutation?
No, it's a great point. Still up for discussion. As I shared, we don't have the phase 3 design set just yet. If we end up kind of keeping that strict criteria for the 2 recessive mutations, one thing we were thinking of doing is, let's say we have our phase 3 trial. If we have that, what's called an expanded access program that's alongside it, that might be where we can collect data on populations that are on people who are not able to be in the phase 3 study. Sometimes the phase 3 study needs to be fairly stringent in terms of the entry criteria to keep it very controlled and to kind of lock in the data that we think that we'll have. But still open for discussion, debate, and we, again, don't want to leave anyone behind. We just may need to be creative in finding other avenues for data. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.